I mentioned this before in a previous video, but one of the things I'd like to start doing on this channel is talking about the books as I start reading them. In addition to giving them a review when I finish them, just talk about what I'm starting to read and why. So a book that I started to read just yesterday is 9 Princes in Amber, which is one of 5 books contained in this volume here, the Chronicles of Amber. And I'll just give my brief background on why I decided to pick up this book, what about it looks appealing to me, what I hope to get out of it, etc. Now again, I've not read this book yet, so this is all kind of speculation about what I think the book will contain. So take that into account when deciding whether or not to continue watching this video or not. But yeah, the Chronicles of Amber is something that I had never heard of until, I don't know, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think, when I was watching one of Steve Donahue's videos over at Steve Reads. And with apologies, I can't remember which video it was. It would be nice to link to the video in question. But if you watch any of Steve Donahue's stuff, you know he does like 3 videos a day, every day. And it's a little bit difficult to keep track of what you saw when. But this was one of the videos he did fairly recently when he was doing, I believe it was his Q&A video. And somebody asked him what he thought about the Chronicles of Amber. And I don't remember exactly what his answer was, but it was something like, the first 5 books are really good, and then after that the quality drops off dramatically. Now, I never heard of the Chronicles of Amber before, and in fact, in the video, I think Steve Donahue makes some sort of a comment like, okay, most of you aren't going to know what that is, but for those of you who know what it is, here's my opinion. But anyways, it sounded interesting, just based on the title, and I don't know, just based on the fact that people were talking about it. So I Googled it and pulled up the Wikipedia page, and it's a fantasy series that was first published, I believe, what's the copyright on this? Yeah, 1970 was the first book, and then it goes 1972, second book, 1975, 1976, 1978. And again, according to Wikipedia, there are 2 series. I think, although I don't remember for a certainty that this is what Steve Donahue was talking about when he said there was a drop-off in quality, I think he was maybe talking about the second series. I just skimmed Wikipedia, I didn't read it in depth, but it sounded interesting for what it was. Something about, you know, magicians kind of traveling between 2 worlds. There seemed to be some Arthurian overtones, like references to the legend of Prince Arthur. For example, the second book in the series is called The Guns of Avalon. Avalon, of course, being the mythical legendary island associated with the King Arthur stories. The second book, the second series is something about a guy named Merlin, so I thought maybe that was, you know, the Merlin of the King Arthur series. So it sounded vaguely intriguing, some sort of stories about magicians between 2 worlds set in modern day, but also something about a fantasy world. I didn't completely read up on it, and I'm glad I didn't completely read up on it, because that would spoil the fun of reading the series. But this was vaguely the impression I got, and I thought to myself, that sounds really interesting. I'd really like to read it someday. I'm never going to come across it in Vietnam, because that's where I live, here in Vietnam. But you never know what you might or might not come across. And so just the other day, I was going through what in Saigon is called Book Street, which is where a lot of used books are sold by used booksellers. And you can find all sorts of random things there. You can never find exactly what you're looking for, as with any used book sale, especially out here in Asia. But you find all sorts of random stuff. And I found this here. The Chronicles of Amber, and it's in a series called Fantasy Masterworks, Volume 6. I spent a while in the bookstore flipping through this, trying to remember if this was the first books in the series or the later books in the series, because there's nothing worse than buying what you think is a standalone book or an introduction, and then you get it home and you find out it's actually like the 4th book in a series. which happens all the time in fantasy. I don't know about you, this seems to happen all the time with me, where sometimes the publishers don't actually put, this is actually the 7th book in a series, they don't actually put that on the top, which they should do, but I think they don't want to scare off new readers and you don't realize until you get the book home. Anyways, I got this home and I realized that this was actually, going to Wikipedia again, the first 5 books in the series. And the first 5 books form what is, I believe, one complete cycle. And then the next 5 books form the next cycle, which apparently has a drop-off in quality. I've been, in the past couple days, trying to walk that thin line where I do just enough research about these books to see if it's something that would interest me without doing too much research and spoiling stuff. And I think I'm right at that sweet spot right now, where I believe I've discovered this doesn't really have much to do with the King Arthur stories, despite some of the similarities in the names. The first 5 books of the series is supposed to be the best. It's yeah, again, they were originally published in the 1970s, so they're a cult classic of sorts. And this is another thing when you pick up a fantasy book, right? Because I'm someone who might call, I don't know, I've never been huge into fantasy books, largely because I don't have the patience to read a lot of books. I'm a terribly slow reader. I am attracted to fantasy as a genre, though, in terms of like movies and comic books, and always have been. But the difficulty is finding a good fantasy book, because when you go to the bookstore, there's tons of fantasy books, but there's a lot of junk in that genre, and I've read a number of bad ones over the years. The advantage of going to a fantasy classic is that at least it seems to have passed the test of time and has a lot of people attesting for it, rather than something brand new right off the shelves. And this, I don't know if you can call something from the 1970s a classic, although they do. They call this Fantasy Masterworks here. And then on the back of the series they say, Fantasy Masterworks is a library of some of the greatest, most original, and most influential fantasy ever written. These are the books which, along with Tolkien, Peake, and others, shaped modern fantasy. I hate to admit this, I don't know who Peake is, or I don't recognize the name at the time. But yeah, Tolkien, everybody knows Tolkien. So yeah, they're making the claim that these books are what helped shape the modern fantasy industry as we know it. Yeah, the 1970s isn't a classic when you compare it to like the Iliad or something, but it's a classic of sorts in the modern publishing industry. You know, there's been so much stuff that's been published over the last 50 years which is not still in print, so if they're still publishing this. So this is the first 5 books in this volume, but I'm going to treat them as if they were separate books. Meaning I'm going to read the 9 Princes in Amber, I'm going to review it. If I decide to continue with the next book, I'm going to do another video where I say, okay, I'm starting with the next book, and then review it, and then just break it up in that way, because that's the way they were originally published. I believe this is unabridged. It's a thick volume, as you can see, but then considering that there are 5 books in here, it's not as thick as you might think. It only comes in as to 772 pages. But there's nothing here to indicate that it's abridged. So just going to treat each book as a separate one. What else was I going to say about this? Oh, I'm a little late making this video. I actually started this book yesterday, but didn't get a chance to sit down with the camera yesterday. So I am 16 pages into it now. And we'll just make some comments about what I'm reading now. It appears to start off set in modern day, or I guess what was modern day in 1970. And it's a classic kind of guy wakes up and has forgotten his memory story. apparently has forgotten his memory because he's been getting injected with a lot of drugs after a car accident. And he suspects that he's being injected with a lot of drugs on purpose because somebody wants to keep him out of the picture. Although he doesn't remember who that somebody was and what that picture is. So he breaks out of the hospital and has been trying to recover his memory. And I'm just at the part now where he's met up with a person who he thinks is his sister, because that was the address given in the hospital of the person who was paying his bill. And he's tracked her down at his house and he's having a conversation with her. And there's some sort of hint about hints of something going on. It's a little bit difficult to describe, and it's being deliberately kept vague. The writing style is good. It's a little bit confusing at points. Where was it? He's talking about his sister. And for example, this part here. The woman behind the desk wore a wide-colored, V-necked dress of blue-green, had long hair and low bangs, all of a cross between sunset clouds and the outer edge of a candle flame in an otherwise dark room, and natural, I somehow knew, and her eyes behind glasses I didn't think she needed were as blue as Lake Erie at 3 o'clock on a cloudless summer afternoon, and the color of her compressed smile matched her hair. All one sentence here, although there's a semicolon in there, so maybe he's cheating a little bit. But, you know, I was reading that and I thought, oh wait, okay, what is the sunset clouds? Is that referring to her low bangs or her shirt? Or is that referring to the literal sunset clouds out the window? It's a really confusing sentence. Now, to be fair, I picked that out because that was the example that jumped out at me at page 12 after I'd been reading relatively readable prose up until then. There had been a couple sentences before that were a little bit opaque. But yeah, you can see at points the author is playing with a rather literary style that can be a little bit difficult to decipher at times, but for the most part, it does seem to be highly readable. The whole thing about waking up and having lost your memory is a cliche, and so that got me thinking, oh boy, is this going to be a cliche? But it seems to be fairly interesting what's coming up after that. I was reading online again that at one point there was interest in turning this into a TV show. I found an article online. It was from a few years ago. I don't remember the year, but a couple of years ago. That somebody thought this could be the next Game of Thrones. Because apparently there's a lot of intrigue and backstabbing in this series. So they were talking about turning this into a TV show. And then as far as I know, just because that was the only article I could find a few years ago, and doesn't seem to be much else on the internet about it, that project seems to have gotten dropped. But I guess that does give you an idea of maybe what kind of a story you could expect from this. So that's where I'm at right now. And I'm going to try and continue reading this book, and then when I finish it, I'll come back with a review. If I finish it, there's always I don't finish some of the books I start. I'm rather terrible that way. I know that's a bad habit, but that's an outside possibility. Speaking of which, I do have somewhat mixed feelings about starting this book because I am at the moment halfway through like 10 books, which I really should be reading instead. For example, Don Quixote, which I've been reading for more than 2 years now. Getting there, but just can't seem to buckle down and focus and make a lot of progress on this. I'm a terrible reader that way, unfortunately. But then on the other hand, when something grabs me, it does really grab me. So sometimes I figure if you're just stuck and you're not making progress on any of the books you're supposed to be currently reading, maybe it's good to switch it up for a little bit and then try and come back. I'm always a little bit worried I'm going to end up dropping some books that I do intend to finish. And I do intend to finish Don Quixote one of these days. I'm getting there. I've only got about 200 pages left to go here. It's a bit of a slog, Don Quixote. Anyways, I'm rambling, so I'm going to shut the video off here. And if I finish this book, I'll come back with a full review at that time.